We are now down to 8 days, and the old Beatles song 8 days a week really makes sense because if we'd had 8 days a week all along, it certainly wouldn't seem so frightening, would it? Most of my messages for the last couple of weeks have been a little more esoteric, philosophical. I hope they've been valuable if you've been watching or listening. I've certainly gotten a lot of comments from folks literally around the world, and I appreciate that. I hope that the messages have been useful. I thought today I'd take a slightly different tact, a little more practical, if you will. Most of you are going to have to take essay questions of some type in next week's bar exams. I wanted to talk a little bit about what skill is really being tested on the essays, and it really doesn't matter what jurisdiction you're in. I'm going to be quoting to you from the State Bar of California. It's obviously one of the more difficult exams, and the examiners are trying to respond to what they perceive as happening with applicants, but their words really apply across the board. They're very consistent with what I see in New York, Florida, Texas, Georgia, all the states that we teach in. A lot of you are using this time when it comes to the state materials and the essays in trying to memorize the law, to learn more law, to get more law in your head, so that on test day you can go out and recite that law. You can put it on the paper. Some of you call it regurgitation. Some of you are a little more graphic and just say, I'm vomiting on the page. Either way, it's not a very pretty picture, is it? And if you're in our course, I feel very strongly about the writing style. In fact, I think that a big part of the reason for our much greater than state average passing rate is because we teach a style of writing that puts less emphasis on memorization and more emphasis on making arguments, on actually working through the material and showing the examiners how you would reason through a problem and how you would literally take the reader through and make arguments. And I think that's a good thing to be doing. So my message to you this week, and certainly at the start of this week, is don't be worried about memorization so much. Be worried about how you're using the law. Be worried about how you analyze. The State Bar of California, as I said, put together a description and grading of the California bar exam. It's a pretty clear document, and I think it reflects their response to a pass rate that historically has been 40 to 50%. What they're really saying in their description of the essay questions, I find fascinating. And so I'm actually going to read it to you verbatim with a few comments because I think that they are absolutely spot on. Now, in California, if you're not familiar, they give 1-hour essay questions, but the truth is that the words that they say about these essays could literally come from what I've seen in other jurisdictions. It's really no different in a shorter answer jurisdiction. But here's what the examiners say. The essay part of the exam is an applicant's ability to analyze legal issues arising from fact situations. If you're in our course, the word issues just makes my skin crawl. So I'm going to restate that my way, which is to say that this part of the exam is designed to measure an applicant's ability to analyze legal disputes arising from fact situations. But either way, notice what they say. It arises from fact situations. They go on to say, answers are expected to demonstrate the applicant's ability to analyze the facts of the question. That's the second time they've used that word. To tell the difference between material facts, the third time, and immaterial facts. That's 4 times. To discern the points of law and fact 5 times upon which the question turns. So in 2 sentences, they've used the word fact 5 times. Now, I know that there are people out there, particularly in California, who think that it's just horrendous that anyone would write about the facts. It's interesting to me that the examiners use that word 5 times in the first 2 sentences to talk about what they want. In other words, they want to know if you can tell the difference between what's relevant and irrelevant. How do you do that? By writing about disputes. And then to discern, I love the word discernment because that's very different than a memorized checklist or an attack outline. To discern the law and fact upon which the question turns. In other words, can you figure out what's important versus issue spotting? The examiners go on to say that the answer must show knowledge and understanding of the pertinent principles and theories of law, their qualifications and limitations, and their relationships to each other. In other words, you have to understand how the law works, how it works in relationship to the facts of the problem itself. Notice they're not saying anything about memorized law here. Then the examiners go on to say the answer should evidence the applicant's ability to apply the law to the given facts, there's that word again, and to reason in a logical, lawyer-like manner from the premises adopted to a sound conclusion. And then they finish with this sentence, which I think really says it all. An applicant should not merely show that they remember the legal principles, but should demonstrate their proficiency in using and applying them. Now listen to what they said. It's not just showing that you remember, in other words, memorized legal principles, but demonstrate your proficiency. Now, how do you use a legal principle? How do you show that you're proficient in a principle? And it seems to me the obvious answer is you make arguments. You set up an argument and you support it with the law. It is that proficiency that the examiners are looking for. How do you do that in your writing? You don't try and just put down rules of law. You don't take that attack outline and simply say, here's everything I know about this subject, whether it applies or not. You show both sides of a dispute, and then you demonstrate and articulate how that works in the context of the particular problem that you've got in front of you. That's what you have to do to be successful. Now, how does that translate to what happens here at 8 days out before the exam? If you're planning on taking the next 8 days to do a lot of memorization, I think it's not going to be very helpful for you, no matter what course you're in or how you're trying to get through all of this. The more effective thing to be doing right now is to think about how you would use the law to support particular arguments or positions, to see how the law interacts. That might mean doing some practice questions if you haven't been doing a lot of that. If you're in our course, it certainly means going through and following the writing style that we've been teaching. I want you to know the law. You need to have the law, but simply putting the law down on the paper by itself isn't going to be sufficient. Going out and trying to issue spot isn't going to be sufficient. Remember, that's not discernment. That's just, here's everything I know about this subject, and it's not very compelling. Use your time this week to think purposefully and to work in very direct ways. The examiners here in California are speaking for all of the examiners when they say, look, we're just not interested in whether or not you have this skill of memorization. It's a skill that's no longer in value in the profession of practicing law. It's like saying, well, I'm a great horse and buggy driver. And it may be, but there isn't much call for it these days. There isn't much need for people who can memorize and recite. That's not what we're doing here. When I think about memorizing and reciting, I think about an actor, and you're memorizing and reciting your lines. That's a really good skill. But for a lawyer to memorize and recite the law, not very useful at all. So don't waste your time doing that, and don't waste your time preparing for something that isn't going to get you much value on the exam. If you can do that, if you can keep your focus on what the examiners have said they're really interested in, if you can write essays that show how you use the law and use it in the support of arguments, you stand a very good chance of getting passing scores and doing well on the exam. And so I'll leave you with that at this 8th day. Be focused, be productive in your work, but do the things that are going to pay benefits for you in 8 days. And memorization, not on that list. Have a great study day. We'll be back again later this week as we get closer to your exam.